You know, when you think of fascinating books of the Bible, there are a lot of different fascinating books that probably come to mind. You probably have your favorites. Maybe you think of Genesis, with the wonderful account of creation, the flood, or Exodus with the parting of the Red Sea and God delivering the Israelites out of Egypt. Perhaps you think of Jonah for its obvious reasons, or maybe Samuel that tells about David and Goliath. Some might even go to the New Testament and think of the book of Acts and the start of the church, and as it begins to grow and multiply in Paul's ministry throughout Asia, or maybe even Revelation with its prophecies of the end times. There's all kinds of books that come to mind. They're very fascinating books to read and to study. Well, this morning I want to draw your attention to another fascinating book, one that tells about a young man, about a young woman by the name of Esther. Not only does it talk about who she was, but what she did for her people. This is the story of a girl who went from being a Jewish orphan to being the queen of Persia. Now she saved her people from the hands of a wickedly self-absorbed man named Haman. But what really sets this book apart from all of the other books is that God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. From the beginning to the end, we are told the story of Esther from a human perspective. And even though we can't see God in the book, or I should say he's not mentioned in the book, we see him working. God's providence is at work, even though they didn't know it. Let me give you some quick historical background into Esther. Civil war had resulted in Israel being divided into two kingdoms. There was the northern kingdom, known as Israel, and then the southern kingdom, now known as Judah. Now, because neither kingdom really honored God and lived for God, he allowed them to be taken into captivity. And Assyria took the northern kingdom of Israel, and Babylon took the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, eventually, Babylon is overpowered by the Medes and the Persians. And when that happens, the Jews, at least some of them, are allowed to return to their homeland. Now, Zerubbabel leads the first group back. And then after some time passes, Ezra leads a second group back. Some more time passes, and finally Nehemiah leads a third group back to Jerusalem. But there are still some Jews, for whatever reason, who decided to remain in Persia. And it is that group of people, that group that remained there in Persia, that group is found in the book of Esther. Now, there are two subtle temptations that face the Jews who are living in Persia. First of all, assimilation. This is the challenge was, how do we continue to live as citizens of Persia and yet at the same time retain our cultural and religious distinctives? The science fiction series Star Trek: The Next Generation, some of you will be familiar with that. It's a TV series. They had a particularly nasty opponent that were called the Borg. Now, the thing about the Borg, their method of operation was to take people captive and then assimilate them into their group. Their slogan was, "Resistance is futile, you must be assimilated." Now, in the same way, Persia had a same type of method. They captured people, they took them in, and then they wanted to assimilate them into one single entity, right? Make them not just citizens of Persia, but everything they thought, everything they said, everything they did was to be Persian. They wanted them to be just alike. The other temptation that they faced was despair. Despair comes from that feeling where, you just kind of feel like God's not really at work. He's not at work in my life. He's not at work in the world. He just seems to have disappeared. And you kind of fall into this despair. Well, that certainly was a challenge for the people, the Jewish people in Persia, because, as I said, God's not even named in the book of Esther. It was so hard for them to see that he was even at work. The book of Esther is knowing God is at work, even when you can't see him, even when you don't know how. God is at work behind the scenes. Someone once said, God's like my pastor. I don't see him during the week, and I don't understand him on Sundays. Well, God doesn't typically work through miracles and drama. We would like for him to do that. We sort of expect him to do that because we see him do that in the Bible. When we read about the incredible acts that God did, it's hard not to get discouraged by the fact that he's not acting that way in my life. Right? He's not doing the big miracles. He's not involved in the drama. It just doesn't seem that way. But in reality, that's not really the way he worked all that often in the Bible either. More often than not, he worked in subtle ways in the Bible. We like the stories, and we think about the stories where he worked in big ways and where he did miracles. And yes, he did those. But more often, he did the small stuff. More often, he worked in subtle ways. We just don't think about those stories, and we just don't remember those stories. I think the value of the book of Esther is that it's a book of crisis, something that we can all relate to, and it provides an insight into what God is doing when he chooses to remain silent. We may have a crisis, but God never does. God's never taken off guard or caught by surprise by the things that happen in our life. And even though God's name is not mentioned in the book of Esther, his presence is unmistakable. His control, his care for his people is evident, even in this distant land. I think in a very real way, the book of Esther is a picture or portrait of Romans 8:28. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. God can and does work out everything for good to those who love him. He uses not just good events, nice events, but all events. The best things that happen to you, the worst things that happen to you. Those are God's tools to mold you into the person he wants you to be. Romans 8:28 does not teach that everything always works out for everybody. It is a specific promise for born-again believers. If you know God through a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, you can trust that everything, every event has a divine purpose. Now, the main character is a woman named Hadassah, which means star, but her Persian name you'll know better as Esther. We don't see Esther in the first chapter. We'll get to her in chapter 2. But here in chapter 1, we are introduced to the king, Ahasuerus, the Greek name is Xerxes. Let's look and see what we read here in Esther chapter 1, verse 1. Took place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel of Susa. And so, like most kings, Ahasuerus was a proud man. And in this chapter, we see a lot of evidence of his pride. We see, first of all, this fabulous celebration that he has. Verse 3, it says, "In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes and attendants and the army of officers of Persia and Media. The noble, the prince of all of his provinces began being in his presence, and he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days." All right, so 3 years in to his reign, he gets this idea that he needs to show off his greatness, his riches, his power, all that he has. And so he throws this nationwide feast. Lasted 180 days, 6 months. A 6-month celebration. Now, I don't imagine that all of these officials and all of these royal officers and the army and so forth were all in one place for a straight 6-month period of time. That would have completely shut down his kingdom for 6 months. It's probably more likely that they took turns. Some would come and then they would go back to work, and then others would come and they would go back to work. But the bottom line is it lasted for 6 months. He's showing off his riches, his wealth. He's a very proud man. So after this 180 days, verse 5 says, "When these days were completed, the king gave another banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel in Susa, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were hanging of fine white and violet linen, held by cords of fine purple linen, of silver rings and marble columns, couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of marble, mother of pearl and precious stones. Drinks were served in the golden vessels of various kinds. The royal wine was plentiful according to the king's bounty. The drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion, for so the king had given order to each official of his household that he should do according to the desires of each person. And Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus." So at the end of the 6 months, the king throws another banquet, this one lasting 7 days. This one was for the citizens of the city, from the least to the greatest, it says. He spared no expense. Not only that, the queen decided she's going to have her own banquet for the women. So she puts on her own party. And during this celebration time, the king made a demand of the queen. Let's talk about this foolish command. On the last day of the banquet, the king had what he thought was an inspiration. This would be a great idea. While I'm displaying all the beautiful things that I have not yet displayed the beauty of my queen. And so he gathers together his officials. Verse 11, he tells them to bring Queen Vashti before the king with a royal crown in order to display her beauty to all the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. Now, there's not a whole lot known about Vashti, except that she was Ahasuerus' wife. She was very beautiful, apparently. And on the last day of the feast, the now drunk king, demanded the queen to be brought before him and show off her beauty. Now Vashti hears about this command of the king, and she refuses to do it. She's determined not to obey the king, not to go to his party. She doesn't want to have any part of that. Now, the officials, they're at a loss. What do we do? I mean, no one has disobeyed the king before. I mean, it didn't matter that he was her husband. He was the king. Nobody disobeys the king. So they go back and they deliver the news, and you can imagine the scene. Verse 12. Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs, and the king became very angry, and his wrath burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for it was the custom of the king to speak before all who knew law and justice. So he gets together with his wise men. What do we do now? Right? She's refused to come. How should I respond? And the wise men get together and they begin to talk about this, and they give the king some advice, and one of the king's officials offered this advice. And let me just kind of paraphrase verses 16 through 18. This is the advice of one of the wise men. Vashti, the queen, hasn't done wrong just to the king. She's done wrong to everybody. All of the princes, every husband, everywhere. When everybody finds out that she's disobeyed you, king, women everywhere are going to start disobeying their husbands, dishonoring their husbands. We can't let that sort of thing happen in your kingdom, king. So the king says, well, what should we do about it? Banish her. Put her out. And so they offer a fixed course of action. Verse 19. If it please the king, let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be repealed. It's fixed. It cannot be changed. It cannot be undone. That Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. When the king's edict, which he will make, is heard throughout all his kingdom, great as it is, then all women will give honor to their husbands, great and small. This word pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. So he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, and to every man so that every man should be the master of his own house, and the one who speaks in the language of his own people. The king decided that this would be wise. Sure, let's get rid of Vashti, and let's get a new queen. So in verse 19, he dismisses her as queen. She's no longer allowed in his presence. She's stripped of her royal position and sent away. Now, in time, the king would regret that. The king would wish that he had his queen back. Evidently, he loved her, and now is regretting what he has done. But according to the Medo-Persian law, no law or royal decree could be undone. Not even the king. He couldn't say, I changed my mind. Even as king, he had to live with the decision that he made. This would then give way for Esther to enter the picture in the next chapter. So, what difference does any of this make in our lives? I mean, we read the account and we know what's in it, but there's a legitimate question that we ask So what? I mean, what does this mean for me? Well, this is not just another history lesson. You didn't come here this morning to learn about the Persian customs or to hear about how they felt about women. The chapter doesn't mention a single thing about our main character, Esther. So what would God want us to learn from these events? What is it that he wants to teach us from this particular passage of Scripture? And as I spent time thinking about these questions, I realized that there's a couple of important lessons that you and I can learn from this text. Here's how we apply these to our lives. First of all, no one lives independently of God. No one lives independently of God. If you had asked Ahasuerus, or even Vashti, or any of the wise men about God and their responsibility to him, they would have openly mocked you. These were not God-fearing people. They worshiped themselves or any other god that would suit their own desires. They did whatever they wanted in order to get whatever they wanted. But because we've read the rest of the book, we know that God was present all along. You cannot live independently of God. Now, we can choose to reject him. We might choose not to need him or want him. But that's like choosing to live independently of oxygen, right? You can't see it. You can't feel it. You can't touch it. You can even claim that you don't need it. But the moment that it's taken from you, your life ceased to exist. I think David had it right in the Psalms when he wrote Psalm 139, verse 7 through 10. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to the heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, your right hand will lay hold of me. Listen, whether we like it or not, you cannot live independently of God. His presence is evident in your life, and no matter what you do or no matter how much you try to deny it, he is still there. And he's calling you to bring your life into fellowship with him. That's not just how God worked in Esther's day. He's doing it every day. But we also have another lesson to learn here, and that is that God is at work even when we don't know it. You know, sometimes his hand is so obvious that you can't mistake it. There's some things that just happen that you just say, yeah, that had to be God. I mean, it couldn't be anything else but God. And then there are other times that it's not so clear. But God is still at work. God already knows what choices you're going to make. And he has predetermined to bring those choices to pass so that he receives the glory and you benefit. Now, sometimes we don't see the benefit right away. That's why we have to stay close. Stay connected to Jesus. In time, he reveals it to us. There's a lesson that he wants us to learn, or there's something that he wants to do in us or through us, or there's someone else's lives that he wants to touch as a result of something that takes place in our life. We may not see it right away. You may not always see the hand of God, but God is at work for your good and his glory. How does God desire to receive glory from your life? Through a personal relationship with his Son, Jesus Christ, and by bringing you into conformity with himself. Again, I go back to Romans chapter 8. We already talked about verse 28. We know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. We see the purpose in verse 29. For those he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. He wants us to bring us into conformity with himself, with his Son, Jesus Christ. The question I want to ask this morning is, are you willing to allow God to carry out that work in your life? Are you willing to say yes to God even when you don't understand? You see, you are free to choose for or against God. We're all free to choose. But your choosing doesn't void his presence or his hand of providence in your life. It only forfeits your enjoyment of it and the blessings you might receive as a result of it. You're free to choose your own way, but God is still God, and he is still going to bring it past his will. And in the end, you and I, we're the ones that suffer if we don't choose to follow God. And so would you admit to him today that you are aware of his work in your life? Would you pause to realize that you're not here by accident? That God orchestrated the events of your life, of your week, even of this day, so that you would be in this service, hearing this message, so that he could do a great work in your life. Would you surrender your will to him? Would you make it your choice to live absolutely dependent on him? To live in cooperation with him, to live every moment in such a way that he receives the glory? I will tell you this, choosing to live that way, you receive a blessing. There are benefits. Choosing to live your own way, you will reap the consequences. Which way will you choose? God bless.